am Shivaji Bhaskar, Faculty of Russian at the School of Foreign Languages, IGNOU. I welcome you all to this course, Basics of Russian, Communication Skills, Part 1. As you remember that in the previous module, we have discussed the relationship between the adjectives and nouns and the agreement between their endings. We have seen in the certain case where we are talking about the case where we indicate the noun or the adjective with possession, belonging or negation. We have also discussed the plural form of the nouns in certain genders such as masculine, feminine or neuter. Now, in this module, we will be taking up certain aspects of the plural form of the nouns in possession, belonging and negation with the help of questions like kavo. To understand it properly and differentiate between the question kavo and chivo, let's have some examples. В комнате нет друзей. В комнате нет кого. Why kavo? Because we know that drug is an example of an animate noun. So, the plural form of drug in nominative is druzya. And likewise, when we put niet, it certainly changes into niet kavo, niet друзей. Accordingly, let's pay attention to the second one, на столе нет словарей. And the question comes, чего? Why чего? Because чего belongs to the inanimate noun. That is why the question is чего нет на столе. And the plural form of словарь in nominative is словаря. Accordingly, when we put нет, it changes into нет словарей. Accordingly, we shall be taking up a few more examples of the different genders of the Russian language like feminine and neuter, and we shall look at various examples of the nouns in plural. Now, let's go ahead and pay attention to the masculine plural nouns answering the question чей, у кого, кого нет, чего нет and какие. To understand all these questions, let's pay attention to the model. Дом инженеров находится недалеко. So, дом инженеров, дом кого, инженер changes into инженеры and дом чей, дом инженеров. Чей дом находится недалеко, дом инженеров находится недалеко. It clearly indicates the possession or belonging. When we put нет, it indicates negation. So, I hope all of you will pay attention to this aspect clearly while using the Russian grammar rules. Now, let's pay attention to the second one. У инженеров есть своя столовая. У кого есть своя столовая? У инженеров. So, from чей we have changed the question to у кого. Сегодня на заводе нет инженеров. Now, we are saying чего нет. Сегодня на заводе нет инженеров. Кого нет and чего нет as per the requirement of the Russian grammar. Since we have the question кого нет, it is for инженеры. In plural form, after using the нет, it would be инженеров. Now, let's go ahead to understand it clearly. Кого нет на заводе сегодня? Инженеров нет. Now, the second one is у инженеров нет кабинетов. Чего нет у инженеров? Чего? Because кабинет. Улицы городов сегодня пустые. Какие улицы? Here we have used the question какие. Какие улицы сегодня пустые? Улицы городов. So, accordingly, we see that interrogative word чей, у кого and кого нет are used in case of animate only, whereas чего нет and какие indicate inanimate objects here. To understand it properly, now let's take some examples. The questions would be кто, что, нет, and какие. On the other hand, questions are чей, у кого нет, and чего. So, in nominative we have nouns like engineer, студенты, старик, народ, отец, дом, dollar. It should change into engineer would change into engineerов, student changes into студентов, старик changes into стариков, народ changes into народов, отец changes into отцов, дом changes into домов, and dollar changes into долларов, and dollar changes into dollarов. So, accordingly, you may also change them as and when it is required. Now, let us have a few more examples. Город, сад, парк, музей, брат, стуль, друг, гость, преподаватель. So, according to the rules we have learned, город would change into городов, сад would change into садов, парк would change into парков, музей would change into музеев, брат would change into братьев, стул would change into стульев, друг changes into друзей, гость changes into гостей, and преподаватель changes into преподавателей. However, in some examples we see that друг in nominative the plural is друзья, брат the plural is братья, and accordingly you can also change and remember all such different exceptions. Now, let us go ahead and pay attention to a few more examples. Учитель, писатель, врач, товарищ, дядя, сосед, карандаш, нож, словарь. According to the rules, it should change as учитель would change into учителей, писатель would change into писателей, врач would change into врачей, товарищ would change into товарищей, дядя would change into дяди, сосед would change into соседей, карандаш would change into карандашей, нож would change into ножей, and словарь would change into словарей. So, here there are certain different examples of the masculine gender nouns where there are certain nouns of hard ending, there are certain nouns of which ends with soft sign, there are certain nouns which ends with ya like dядя, and there are certain nouns which has certain letters like sh, zh, and soft sign. Now, let us go ahead and pay attention to a few more such examples such as ruble, дедушка, мужчина, человек, ребенок. So, ruble however ends with soft sign, changes into рублей, like писатель changes into писателей. Дедушка ends with a but belongs to the masculine gender, changes into дедушек. Мужчина ends with a, however it belongs to the masculine gender, changes into мужчин. Человек changes into людей. Ребенок changes into детей. So, these are certain exceptions in Russian. So, человек the plural form is люди. Ребенок the plural form is дети, and further in this case when we talk about possession, belonging or negation, человек changes into людей, ребенок changes into детей. But we also need to understand that in certain cases like знакомый, русский, рабочий, all these nouns which have a very different ending which resemble to the ending of any adjective, they change as far as the role of the adjectives we have seen, such as знакомый changes into знакомых, русский changes into русских, рабочий changes into рабочих. So, all these new words you have to remember in order to use them properly while doing the exercises of the Russian grammar. Alright, now let us go ahead and pay attention to the activity. To understand certain nature of the Russian grammar and its rules, let us pay attention to the model. У in bracket дети есть игрушки. So, according to the rule of this particular case, we have у kavvo because jechi. It's an animate. So that is why when you have animate noun, it should change as per the rules of the grammar of this case as kavvo. U kavvo, u dziecię jest igruszki. And accordingly, if you pay attention to the rest of the words given in the brackets, you strike out whichever is belong to the animate and put the question u kavvo. And if something is of inanimate nature, put uchivo and solve the exercises accordingly. Now let's go ahead and pay attention to a few more examples. Please pay attention to the model parke nyat in bracket sadovniki. Sadovnik, which means gardener, changes into parke nyat sadovnikov because in nominative sadovniki is the plural of sadovnik, which means gardener, changes into when we put negation nyat sadovnikov. The second one is vetam kioske nyat slavari. Slavari means dictionaries, so it would be nyat slavari. Likewise, u nivo nyat что nyat or kavo nyat. U nivo nyat druzya in bracket у него нет кого друзей. У него нет друзей. В больнице нет врачей. So врачи, plural form of врач, changes into в больнице нет врачей. Accordingly, you can solve the rest of the exercise while using the grammar and its rules. Now let's pay attention to the some of the more examples we have. Now let's go ahead. В этом городе нет. Что нет? Сады in nominative. So sad we know inanimate changes into что нет, чего нет. Чего нет, садов нет. В этом городе нет садов. So accordingly you can change rest of the exercise. Alright, now let's go ahead. Now we shall talk about possession belonging with the interrogative word chei, chia, chio and chi. What does it indicate? It indicates that we have the certain nouns in plural form for feminine, like any word which ends with a or ya, and in certain cases we have certain nouns which ends with short sign, which belongs to the feminine gender. So let's take one example. Зал для аспиранток довольно большой. Чей зал довольно большой. Аспирантка, which is a feminine gender word, takes the form aspirantak for indicating possession belonging. For example, if you have studentka, so studentki, studentak. So according to that grammar pattern, we can also put it here and change. Now let's pay attention to a few more examples and go ahead. Комната дочерей находится на втором этаже. So дочь, дочки, дочерей. Чья комната находится на втором этаже? Комната дочерей. And accordingly, дочь takes the form of дочерей. Дочерей for indicating possession or belonging. Okay, now let's go ahead and pay attention to a few more examples. Рабочие строят общежитие для студенток. So we know студентка means female student. The plural in nominative is studentki, but whenever we use this case, the studentka would change into студенток. Чье общежитие строят рабочие. So студентка takes the form студенток, indicating possession belonging. And here if you pay attention to the ending of чье, it is actually indicating for общежитие. Чье общежитие? Строят рабочие. Рабочие строят общежитие для студенток. So we have to understand the pattern of the grammar while solving. Then the fourth one is Chitraji сестер лежат на полу. Chitraji, plural form, that is why the question is Chi Chitraji лежат на полу. Ci Chitraji лежат на полу. Chitraji sister лежат на полу. So sistra, sistri changes into sister. So in nominative is sistra, the plural is sistri, but in this case changes into sister. Alright, now let's go ahead and pay attention to a few more aspects of the grammar in this case. Possession belonging with the interrogative phrase ukavo. Whenever we have ukavo, it clearly indicates that it is animate. Upadrug, есть своя комната. Padrug is a plural form in this case for padruga. Padruga in nominative, padrugi nominative plural, and padrug in this case plural. У подруг есть своя комната. The question is, у кого есть своя комната? У подруг. Padruga takes the form of padrug for indicating possession, belonging. Likewise, у девушек есть англо-русский словарь. So the question comes, у кого есть своя? У кого есть англо-русский словарь? У девушек. In nominative, девушка, the plural is девушки, but in this case the plural is девушек. So девушка takes the form of девушек for indicating possession. Now let's go ahead and pay attention to another aspect. In inanimate plural nouns which indicates possession, belonging. So let's take a few examples like окна, комнат. Очень маленькие. Окна чего? Окна комнат. So комната in nominative, feminine gender. Комнаты in nominative plural takes the form of комнат. Why? Because in this case when we are indicating possession, belonging, that is why окна комнат очень маленькие. Likewise, страницы тетрадей очень хорошие. Страницы чего? Страницы тетрадей очень хорошие. Тетрадь takes the form of тетрадей. So тетрадь, we know, it is a noun of feminine gender in nominative. Тетради, nominative plural, takes the form of тетрадей, in this case plural. So we have seen both animate and inanimate plural nouns have the same ending while indicating possession and belonging. So this is basically the aspect we were talking about in this particular module regarding the plural forms of nouns in animate and inanimate. So I hope with the help of all these concepts you will be able to do the exercises of the Russian grammar very easily. Now let's go ahead and pay attention to the next concept. So now we have already discussed the plural form of nouns in possession, belonging. Now we shall discuss about while using negation. We very well know that negation, whenever is used, there is the plural form of that particular noun is used in this case, which indicates negation with the help of кого нет, чего нет. So кого for animate and чего for inanimate. To understand it more clearly, let's pay attention to a few examples. В комнате нет сестер. Сестра, we very well know that belongs to the animate. So the plural of sestra is sestri in nominative, but in this case it would be кого нет, нет сестер. So кого нет в комнате? Сестер нет в комнате нет сестер. So the stress is on the plural form of sestra in this case, which is сестер. На столе нет ложек. Ложка, we know, the plural form is ложки, and that is why, because it is inanimate, the question would be чего нет на столе? На столе нет ложек. Now let's go ahead and pay attention to a few more exercises. We will have some examples of the feminine plural nouns which answers the question чей, у кого, кого нет, чего нет, and какие. Before that we have seen the usage of the masculine. To understand it fully, now take some examples. Pay attention to the model. Дом учительниц находится недалеко. Дом кого? Чей дом? So accordingly, while using кого, which means animate, and чей дом? Учительница. Чей дом находится недалеко. Чей дом находится недалеко indicates towards the usage of the plural form of учительницы. In this form, it would be учительниц. У учительниц есть своя столовая. У кого есть своя столовая? У учительниц есть своя столовая. Likewise, сегодня в школе нет учительниц. Кого сегодня нет в школе? So, in all these three cases, we have чей, у кого, and кого. It is basically the plural form of учительницы. In this case, we have been using. So, you have to understand it very clearly in order to answer properly. Alright, now let's go ahead and pay attention to a few more examples. У учительниц нет книг. Whenever we are using нет, it is indicating that it is in negation, and we are talking about plural of the feminine gender. Книга changes into книги, and in this case, книга changes into книг. Чего нет у учительниц? У учительниц нет книг. Улицы деревень чистые. Какие улицы чистые? So, thus in this we see interrogative words чей, у кого, and кого нет are used in case of animate objects, whereas чего нет and какие are using to indicate inanimate objects here. So, I hope these two concepts are absolutely clear to you, whether we are talking about masculine gender or the feminine. Now, let's take a few examples in the nominative and in this. So, we have certain examples of the feminine gender nouns such as подруга, женщина, учительница, преподавательница, книга, бумага, ручка, etc. in nominative form in singular. Now, let's see what kind of chain do we have when we put this with the questions like чей, у кого, кого нет, and чего. So, the question is подруга changes into подруг, женщина changes into женщин, учительница changes into учительниц, преподавательница changes into преподавательниц, книга changes into книг, бумага changes into бумаг, рука changes into рук. So, there are certain changes you can see. Some of the examples like kniga, bumaga, they are of inanimate nature, and rest of the nouns which you have learned here are of animate. Now, let us go ahead in order to understand it fully. Naga changes into nok, gara changes into gor, rika changes into rek, komnata changes into komnat, kvartira changes into kvartir, strana changes into stran, stolica changes into stolic, ulica changes into ulic, pchitsa changes into pchits. So, I hope you will be able to change all these endings of these different nouns as per the rules of the grammar which we are learning in this module. Accordingly, a few more such examples like собака, ручка, девушка, бабушка, игрушка, рубашка, девочка, ложка, and студентка changes into собака changes into собак, ручка changes into ручек, девушка changes into девушек, бабушка changes into бабушек, игрушка changes into игрушек, рубашка changes into рубашек, девочка changes into девочек, ложка changes into ложек, and студентка changes into студенток. Likewise, вилка, аудитория, деревня, песня, тетя, дверь, тетрадь, сестра would change into вилка changes into вилок, аудитория changes into аудитории, деревня changes into деревен, песня changes into песен, тетя changes into тети, дверь changes into двери, тетрадь changes into тетради, сестра changes into сестер. So, it is absolutely different what we have learned. Now, let us talk about a few exceptions in this case. We know that in feminine gender in nominative we have mach, doj. The plural form is for mach is macheri, for doch is docheri, but in this case if we change from singular to the plural, it would change as mach, macheriei, doch, docheriei. So, we have to learn these exceptions as well. So, now we have seen the relationship how the nominative plurals are changing. In this case, when we are talking about possession or belonging or negation, in case of nouns of the feminine gender, nouns of the masculine gender. Now, in order to understand it fully, now let us pay attention to modeling. У сестры есть красивое платье. У сестер есть красивое платье. So, the question is у кого? So, whenever we have this question кого, why? Because сестра animate, that is why the question у кого. У сестер есть красивое платье. Likewise, студентки есть новые учебники. У кого? У студенток. У учительницы. У кого? У учительниц. And likewise, you can change them as per the requirement of the nouns of the feminine gender in this case. Now, let us go ahead and pay attention to a few more exercises. In order to understand it fully, let us pay attention to model. Науру के нет студентки. Науру के нет кого нет студентки. From студентка nominative singular, студентки nominative plural. In this case, it would be студенток. На уроке нет студенток. Likewise, на полке нет тетради. So, in this case, we know chitraj, it's a noun of feminine gender in singular, chitraji plural in nominative. Whenever we are using niyat in plural, in this case it would be chitraji. So, likewise, you can also solve all rest of the exercises. Now, let us go ahead and pay attention to a few more examples. In plural form of nouns, especially when we are talking about the third gender, which is neuter gender in Russian, inanimate plural nouns which indicates possession and belonging. So, there are certain nouns we already know in nominative like akno, pismo, more, polye, etc. Now, let us see how they are changed when they are used in plural. Количество окон в этом доме довольно большое. So, in place of окно, which we know is a noun of neuter gender in nominative, changes into akna, especially when we talk about plural in nominative. But in this case, when we want to indicate the possession, belonging or negation, the noun of the neuter gender changes into okan. So, akno takes the form of okan. Количество окон в этом доме довольно большое. Likewise, for письмо, we have another example. Содержание писем очень интересное. So, письмо, nominative case singular, plural is письма, changes into писем. So, содержание писем очень интересное. Письмо takes the form of писем. Now, let us go ahead and pay attention to next example. Двери, здания, высокие. We know that здание is again an example of neuter gender nominative case singular, but changes into zdania in plural in nominative. In this case, changes into zdani. The above mentioned changes in the endings of the plural nouns indicating possession, belonging are also observed while indicating negation. In this case, the interrogative word chivo is used for inanimate nouns. It is very clear, it is very evident from the beginning of this module and the previous module we have seen, and clearly we have indicated all the questions, all the nouns as per the nature, whether they are animate or inanimate, and accordingly we have indicated with kavvo for animate and chivo for inanimate. Now, let us have some examples. На столе нет писем. Чего нет на столе? Чего, because pismo is basically an example of inanimate nature noun in neuter. На университетской территории нет общежития. Чего нет на университетской территории? So, общежитие, again, it's a example of neuter gender noun in nominative which changes into obszerzici in this case. Now, let us go ahead and pay attention to a few more exercises with which we can understand it fully. For that, let us pay attention to model. У них долго нет писем. Чего нет у них долго? Или чего у них долго нет? Писем нет, which is a plural form of письмо in this case. Likewise, здания общежитий современные. Какие здания современные? So, in place of questions like какие in the masculine gender, we have seen in inanimate case it remains same. Likewise, какие здания современные? Какие? So, it is indicating to the общежитие, but since we are talking about plural, so it is общежития in nominative which changes into общежитий. Здания общежитий современные. So, with all these examples, I believe that the concept about these three genders, masculine, feminine and neuter, as far as the plural forms of nouns in animate and inanimate is absolutely clear to you all. I hope you all enjoyed this session. We shall be talking about a few more new concepts of the Russian grammar in our upcoming modules. Thank you.